So the greatest, like most spiritually pure love poetry of the English Renaissance wasn't actually written by some, romantic, unbothered aristocrat just gazing out of a stained glass window.
Yeah, not at all.
It was written by, honestly, a ruthless corporate ladder climber, a man who paid for his wedding with the spoils of a brutal colonization, who crashed other people's parties to hand out his resume, and who literally scrubbed floors to get his university degree.
It's wild to think about.
I mean, we tend to think of these 16th century historical figures as like marble statues, right? Just perfectly refined, completely elevated above the messy realities of rent, ambition, and, political survival.
Yeah, because it shatters that deeply comforting illusion we have about art.
Totally.
We want to believe that transcendent poetry just originates from this serene, enlightened space. And stripping away the anxiety and the sheer desperate hustle that fueled their work feels almost, I don't know, transgressive.
Right, like you're not supposed to talk about it.
Exactly. But to truly understand the text, we have to look at the blood pressure of the author.
Yeah.
I mean, we are looking at a literary landscape in 16th century England that was a high-stakes, brutally competitive enterprise.
Which is exactly why you are here with me today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Our mission today is to basically tear down the marble statue of Edmund Spenser.
I love that. Let's tear it down.
We are going to comprehensively unpack his life, his chaotic times, and the revolutionary poetry that emerged from that very specific friction. By the end of this conversation, you won't just have a timeline of a dead poet. You're going to understand the underlying mechanisms of how his work permanently rewired the English language.
And to do that, we are leaning heavily on a stack of 4 incredibly dense scholarly units you've brought to the table.
Oh, yeah, they are heavy.
Very. These materials trace a massive arc from the broader seismic shifts of the English Renaissance and Reformation down into Spenser's incredibly gritty biography, and then, his subversive Amoretti sonnets, and finally his major marriage anthems, the Epithalamion and the Prothalamion.
And I think the most vital thread connecting all these sources is just context. You cannot just stare at a 16th century love poem on a blank page and expect to comprehend its gravity.
No, the words don't exist in a vacuum.
Right. If you don't understand the intense geopolitical, religious, and economic pressures the author was navigating, the lines just read like, flowery, archaic romance.
Which is how most people read them, unfortunately.
Exactly. So before we even touch Spenser's poetry, we need to map the battleground he was born into. We need to talk about the English Renaissance.
And the first and arguably most important thing to realize about the English Renaissance is that it was remarkably late.
Like really late.
So late. The cultural explosion that we associate with the rebirth of classical learning hit England decades, if not a whole century, after it had already transformed continental Europe.
Let's trace that timeline back a bit. Our sources pinpoint a specific geopolitical earthquake that set the continental Renaissance in motion, right? The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453.
Yeah, though its profound cultural aftershocks really crystallized toward the end of the 15th century, around 1493, as the intellectual landscape really shifted.
Why that event specifically?
Because that event triggered a massive brain drain. You had Greek scholars fleeing Constantinople, seeking refuge in the West, and they didn't just bring themselves, they brought their libraries.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they brought a vast treasure trove of ancient Greek texts, philosophy, literature, science, stuff that had been entirely lost or just ignored by Western Europe during the Middle Ages.
And all of that flooded into Italy.
Exactly. That sudden influx acted as a catalyst. It sparked what we now call Italian humanism.
I want to pause on the term humanism for a second because it gets thrown around a lot.
It does.
In this specific 15th century Italian context, it marks a violent pivot away from medieval scholasticism, which was like almost exclusively focused on theology and the afterlife.
Right, just waiting for heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Humanism shifted the lens back to human potential, the physical human form, and the wisdom of classical antiquity.
It was a complete revolution in human self-perception. You had figures in Italy like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, and they started transloading Plato and re-examining the universe, not just as a waiting room for heaven, like you said, but as a theater of human dignity and agency.
They were obsessed with the beauty of classical thought.
Totally obsessed. And eventually, this intellectual shockwave crossed the English Channel. Early English scholars, men like Thomas Linacre and John Colet, they traveled to Italy, immersed themselves in this new humanist philosophy, and brought it back to institutions like Oxford and Cambridge.
So the universities got the software update.
That's a great way to put it.
But according to the sources, even though English schools were teaching this cutting-edge humanist curriculum, English literature itself was completely stagnant. Like, if the scholars are reading Homer and Cicero, why aren't the writers producing the English equivalent?
Because the English language was basically suffering from a massive inferiority complex.
Wait, really? A language with low self-esteem?
Pretty much. It was socially, politically, and intellectually marginalized. I mean, if you walked into the royal court, the language of power, diplomacy, and elite status was still predominantly French.
Right.
And if you walked into a university lecture hall, the language of serious intellectual pursuit was Latin. English was viewed as this crude, barking dialect of the peasantry.
Just tavern talk.
Exactly. It was considered fundamentally immature, like utterly incapable of handling the sophisticated philosophical nuances or the refined emotional registers of the Renaissance.
That is just fascinating to think about. There was no real tradition of high art English verse or powerful English prose at this time, despite Chaucer having made massive strides in the late 14th century, right?
Yeah, but Chaucer was almost viewed as a solitary peak rather than the foundation of a continuing tradition.
So how does a marginalized language suddenly catch up to a century of continental innovation?
Through technology. The printing press was the great amplifier of the English Renaissance.
Brought in by William Caxton.
Right, William Caxton. It completely bypassed the slow, elite, monastic scriptoriums. It allowed these newly rediscovered classical texts to be translated from Latin and Greek directly into the vernacular, the everyday English that people actually spoke in the streets of London.
So it democratized the intellectual revolution.
It did. And the real literary spark, the moment English literature realized it could actually compete, came through translation. Our sources highlight two crucial figures here: Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey.
Right, the early adapters.
Yes, they started translating contemporary Italian verse, specifically the intricate, emotionally complex sonnets of Petrarch, straight into English.
And their translations were basically the proof of concept.
Exactly. Wyatt and Surrey demonstrated to the English elite that their native tongue could indeed hold the rhythm, the complex paradoxes, and the high art of the Italian Renaissance. They proved English wasn't just for tavern songs. It could be the language of kings and courtiers.
But this is where the English Renaissance diverges wildly from the Italian version. Because England wasn't just importing sensual Italian poetry, they were importing it during a period of catastrophic religious trauma.
The Protestant Reformation.
Right, it's happening simultaneously.
And this is the central friction of the era. The Continental Renaissance, particularly in Italy, was heavily supported by the Catholic Church and aristocratic patrons. So it could afford to be deeply elitist, lavish, and intensely sensual.
It celebrated the physical form in ways that bordered on paganism, honestly.
Right. But the English version of this cultural rebirth was colliding head-on with a powerful Puritan and Protestant moral vision.
And the reformist spirit was just ripping the country apart.
Yeah.
You have John Wycliffe's early translations of the Bible, William Tyndale's later work, and then the monumental geopolitical rupture of King Henry VIII.
Breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s.
Right, to secure his annulment and establish the Church of England.
And that political break fundamentally altered the cultural DNA of the nation. It opened the floodgates for more radical Protestant factions, Puritans, Calvinists, Presbyterians, to exert immense cultural pressure.
They preached a doctrine of strict austerity, right? Profound suspicion of visual imagery or idolatry, and a highly regulated moral code. So wait, just think about the psychological cognitive dissonance of an educated English writer in this period. On one hand, you are discovering this beautiful, intoxicating, sensual Italian art and poetry.
You're enraptured by it.
Yeah, you are enraptured by the humanist celebration of earthly beauty. But on the other hand, your strict Protestant theology is basically screaming at you that the sensual indulgence is sinful.
It's worldly and potentially a one-way ticket to damnation.
So they loved the beautiful Italian art and poetry, but felt incredibly guilty about it because of their strict Protestantism.
That is the perfect way to put it. It's a paralyzing psychological tightrope. Our sources emphasize that while the Italian influence on English literature is undeniably the aesthetic driver, it is constantly, fiercely harnessed to an essentially Christian, Protestant, moral framework.
You see this relentless battle playing out line by line in the poetry.
Oh, absolutely. It's a desperate fascination with the sensual, paired with a compulsive need to morally justify it. They wanted the aesthetic majesty of the Italian Renaissance, but they demanded the spiritual purity of the Protestant Reformation.
Synthesizing those two opposing worldviews became the great literary project of the age.
It really did.
And as if a massive religious and cultural crisis wasn't enough, the literal ground beneath their feet was shifting. The economy and the social hierarchy were undergoing a complete teardown of the old feudal order.
Yet to understand the economic anxiety of this period, we have to look back at the demographic catastrophe of the preceding centuries.
The plague.
The bubonic plague, yeah. The Black Death. England had been a strictly agrarian feudal society, but repeated waves of the plague had wiped out a staggering percentage of the population.
And while horrific on a human level, on a macroeconomic level, a massive population drop creates an unprecedented labor shortage.
The basic laws of supply and demand kicked in. If you were a peasant who survived the plague, your manual labor suddenly became an incredibly scarce, highly valuable commodity.
Right. The lords of the manors were desperate for workers to harvest their crops.
Desperate. And this gave the peasantry leverage they had never possessed in the history of the feudal system. They could demand better wages, leave oppressive estates, and actually acquire their own parcels of land.
Wow.
Yeah, this upward mobility led to the creation of a powerful new class of small independent farmers known as yeomen.
So it's the birth of a nascent middle class. But the wealthy landowners weren't just going to pay exorbitant wages, right? They found a loophole.
Oh, they found a ruthless loophole. They pivoted their agricultural model entirely. Instead of relying on labor-intensive crops like wheat, they switched their vast estates over to sheep pasture.
Sheep.
Sheep, because sheep rearing requires vastly fewer workers than traditional farming. You need a few shepherds and some dogs, and you can manage massive tracts of land.
This triggers the famous English wool boom. And this socioeconomic pivot completely infects the literature of the time.
It really does.
Like, when we read Renaissance poetry, there's an absolute obsession with the pastoral genre. Poems about shepherds, flocks, rolling hills, and rural simplicity. It's so easy to assume they were just dutifully copying the ancient Roman pastoral poems of Virgil.
Right, well, they were certainly utilizing classical tropes, but the massive popularity of the pastoral wasn't just academic cosplay. It reflected the dominant economic reality of the English countryside.
The sheep was the engine of the English economy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when poets wrote about shepherds, they were engaging with a very contemporary, recognizable landscape.
Meanwhile, as the countryside is covered in sheep, London is exploding into a dense, chaotic commercial hub. We see the rise of powerful merchant classes, global traders, and artisan guilds.
You have an influx of individuals flooding into the city seeking economic gain. This is a population that historically had zero political or cultural voice.
Right.
But now they are acquiring wealth, they are gaining access to humanist education, they're becoming highly literate, and they form a massive, hungry new audience for literature. The old aristocratic monopoly on culture is fracturing.
Let's synthesize this. You have a society experiencing radical upward mobility, a booming commercial economy, deep religious anxiety, and isolation from Catholic Europe.
And that isolation breeds a fierce defensive nationalism.
Right, because England was effectively excommunicated from the major European political alliances after breaking with Rome, it had to turn inward.
It sparked an intense, ambitious English nationalism. Writers were no longer content to just translate Italians. They wanted to conquer them.
They were actively engaged in a cultural arms race.
Yes. Driven to prove that the English vernacular could produce epics and lyrics that rivaled the greatest achievements of Greece, Rome, and Florence.
They took the continental aesthetic, injected it with fierce Protestant morality, and used it to build a mythic national identity.
And that specific cocktail of anxiety, ambition, and nationalistic fervor is the exact environment that forged Edmund Spenser.
Which leads us to the man himself. We need to look closely at Spenser's biography because his life story completely dismantles our preconceived notions of who a Renaissance poet actually was.
It really does.
I always pictured the archetypal courtier poet as a wealthy nobleman, someone with a massive ancestral estate, casually writing sonnets between falconry and sword practice.
Right, the hobby.
Yeah. But Spenser's reality was incredibly gritty.
He was a commoner, born around 1552 in London to a distinctly poor family. Now, the sources suggest he may have been distantly, peripherally related to a wealthy Midlands family of Spensers, who made a fortune in that very sheep-rearing boom we just discussed. But that connection offered him zero immediate financial benefit. He had no safety net, no inheritance, and no aristocratic title.
He did, however, get access to the one thing that could change his trajectory, right? A cutting-edge humanist education.
Yes. He was enrolled as a quote-unquote poor boy at the Merchant Taylors Grammar School. And this is crucial. It was a school established by a commercial guild, the Taylors, not by the aristocracy.
Okay, some mercantile money.
Exactly. And it offered a rigorous, progressive humanist curriculum. He was immersed in Latin, Greek, some Hebrew, and music. He was being intellectually armed.
Then he gets to Cambridge University. But he doesn't arrive as a gentleman scholar of leisure.
No.
He goes to Pembroke College as a Caesar. We mean to unpack what that word actually meant for his daily existence, because this completely shatters the illusion. He was literally scrubbing floors to get his degree.
Yeah, being a Caesar was an exercise in intense social humiliation and grueling labor. A Caesar was a poor scholar who was granted a heavily subsidized education, but in exchange he had to undertake menial physical chores around the university.
He was essentially a servant.
He was a servant to the wealthier aristocratic students.
Imagine the psychological toll of that. You are sitting in a lecture hall in the morning, proving your intellectual superiority by translating complex Greek philosophy, and in the evening, you are scrubbing the floors and serving dinner to the wealthy classmates you just intellectually dominated.
It breeds a very specific burning resentment and a relentless drive to climb out of that subservience. It instilled a fundamental belief that his intellectual merit, his humanist education, should grant him the social rank and status that his birth had denied him.
Makes total sense.
Right. And while at Cambridge, he befriended other ambitious middle-class scholars like Gabriel Harvey, who shared this intense atmosphere of social mobility. They genuinely believed their minds could conquer the social hierarchy.
But raw intelligence wasn't enough to survive in Queen Elizabeth's court, was it? You had to play a very specific, highly calculated social game. You had to master the art of the courtier.
Oh, the court was an incredibly dangerous, highly theatrical environment. The behavioral Bible for this world was a book called The Book of the Courtier, written by the Italian diplomat Baldassare Castiglione.
Yeah, what did it say?
It dictated that the ideal courtier must be a polymath, skilled in diplomacy, warfare, music, and poetry.
But there was a massive caveat to displaying these skills.
Yes, the concept of sprezzatura.
Sprezzatura.
It translates roughly to calculated moderation or studied carelessness. Castiglione argued that a true aristocrat must perform incredibly difficult feats, like, writing a perfect sonnet, and make it look entirely effortless, almost accidental.
It's the 16th century humble brag.
Exactly. It was a vital defense mechanism. Aristocratic poets like Sir Philip Sidney or Sir Thomas Wyatt possessed inherited wealth and noble titles. For them, engaging too seriously in the craft of poetry was considered slightly vulgar, almost like manual labor. So they practiced sprezzatura by constantly apologizing for their writing. They framed their groundbreaking poetry as weird toys or idle trifles, just a silly distraction from their real duties as statesmen.
I see the trap here. If you are Sir Philip Sidney, you can afford to call your poetry a joke because you still have a castle and an army.
Precisely.
But Edmund Spenser has no castle. He has no army. If he tells the Queen his poetry is just a silly little hobby, he has absolutely nothing else to offer. He can't afford sprezzatura.
That is the defining pivot of his career. Spenser rejects the aristocratic pose of amateurism. He embraces extreme professionalism. He explicitly brands himself as a poet with a capital P.
Wow.
He positions himself not as a casual dilettante, but as a visionary craftsman, taking on a divine, profoundly serious vocation. The construction of the English national identity through verse. He had to convince the power structures that his specific literary genius was a necessary tool for the state.
He has to hustle. And we see that hustle immediately in his networking. By 1578, he leverages his education to become secretary to the Bishop of Rochester. A year later, he's in the service of the incredibly powerful Earl of Leicester, who is a major favorite of Queen Elizabeth.
He even manages to enter the elite, aristocratic literary circle of Sir Philip Sidney himself.
But London was saturated, right? The competition for patronage at court was vicious and advancement was agonizingly slow.
Spenser realized that to make a massive leap in status and wealth, he had to take a massive risk. He had to leave the center of power and go to the periphery. In 1580, he takes a position in Ireland.
Let's frame what going to Ireland meant in 1580. This wasn't diplomatic posting in Paris. It's like a modern professional taking a dangerous but highly lucrative overseas posting to fast-track their corporate ascent.
That's a perfect analogy. Ireland was an active war zone. It was treated as a brutally oppressed English colony. The indigenous Irish population fiercely, violently resisted English administrative rule and the forced imposition of the Protestant Church.
Oh.
Spenser went over as secretary to Lord Arthur Grey, the newly appointed Lord Deputy of Ireland, a man known for his ruthless, scorched-earth military campaigns against the Irish rebels.
So why would a poet seeking literary fame embed himself in a violent colonial administration?
Because of the staggering economic incentives. The English crown was attempting to permanently subjugate the region through a policy of plantation.
Plantation meaning.
They were seizing lands from defeated Irish lords in the Munster province and giving massive estates to English undertakers. Basically, colonists tasked with repopulating the area with English Protestants.
It's high-risk, astronomical reward venture capitalism. You take a posting in a hostile, dangerous environment, and the government essentially hands you a kingdom.
Spenser fully participated in this colonial enterprise. The poor boy who washed dishes at Cambridge was granted the 3,000-acre estate of Kilkilman Castle in Munster.
3,000 acres.
Yeah, he became a landed gentleman, a colonial administrator, and a magistrate.
And it is inside Kilkilman Castle, actively participating in a brutal occupation, surrounded by immense hostility, that he sits down to write his crowning literary achievement, The Faerie Queene.
It's incredible. He spends years crafting this massive allegorical epic designed to flatter Queen Elizabeth and codify Protestant morality. And in 1589, he travels back to London. And he doesn't just show up. He brings Sir Walter Raleigh with him to secure a direct audience with the Queen.
The ultimate pitch meeting. He reads The Faerie Queene to Elizabeth herself.
And the audacity paid off. Elizabeth was highly receptive. She rewarded him with an annual pension of £50.
Which, in the 1590s, is a life-changing sum of money. It's royal validation.
He had achieved his goal. He had the land, he had the royal pension, and in 1594, he marries Elizabeth Boyle. But the architecture of his success was built on a fault line.
Yeah.
In 1598, the simmering Irish resistance erupts into the massive 9 Years' War. Irish forces attack the Munster plantations. Kilkilman Castle is besieged and burned to the ground.
Everything he spent his entire life building, both the physical wealth and the social status tied to that land, goes up in smoke in a single night.
Spenser and his family narrowly escaped with their lives, fleeing to Cork and eventually back to London, carrying desperate dispatches about the collapse of the colonial government.
It's so tragic.
The trauma, the grueling journey, and the absolute ruin broke his health. He died within a month of returning to London in 1599, effectively in poverty.
What an incredibly tragic, volatile arc. But the literary establishment understood his magnitude, didn't they?
We did. Even though he lost the wealth, the Earl of Essex paid for his funeral, and he was buried in Westminster Abbey, right near Geoffrey Chaucer.
He secured his legacy, but to truly understand how he achieved that legacy, how he fused his fierce ambition with his profound education, we have to look closely at the mechanics of his poetry.
We do.
Spenser set out to conquer the most culturally significant, highly codified literary genre of his time, the poetry of love.
And to understand what Spenser was up against, we need to decode the bizarre rules of courtly love.
Yes, please. Because the way 16th century courtiers talked about love makes absolutely no sense to a modern reader until you trace its weird historical origins.
We have to take a detour back to 11th century France, specifically the regions of Aquitaine and Provence. This is where the troubadour poets invented the entire ideology of courtly love.
Okay.
It was born out of very specific, very strange demographic realities of medieval feudalism.
Walk us through the sociology of a medieval French castle.
So in the 11th century, marriage among the feudal nobility had absolutely nothing to do with romantic attachment. It was a cold, calculated transaction of real estate and military alliances. A lord married a lady to merge their properties and armies.
Very romantic.
Right, because these marriages were entirely political, emotional intimacy was rarely expected, and the lady of the castle was frequently neglected by her husband, who was often away fighting or managing other estates.
And who is left in the castle with the neglected lady?
An army of knights. The castle is filled with young, heavily armed, unmarried men whose entire social purpose is violent service to the lord.
Wow.
So you have an extreme demographic imbalance.
Yeah.
Dozens of aggressive single men, and at the absolute pinnacle of their immediate social hierarchy is one woman, the lord's wife.
I see where this is going. Wait, so courtly love started because castles were basically just a bunch of single-armed guys and one married lady. It's like a medieval bachelorette party that got way out of hand, mixed with a religious cult.
That is hilarious, but honestly pretty accurate. It's a powder keg of masculine aggression and zero female availability. So they have to invent a social code to manage this tension without tearing the castle apart.
Exactly.
They developed a stylized, highly ritualized code of behavior. The knights began directing this intense, idealized, almost religious devotion toward the lady of the castle. Crucially, she was socially and physically inaccessible to them. She was their boss's wife.
This makes the fundamental tenet of courtly love adulterous by definition.
Yes, but it was usually an unconsummated theoretical adultery. It was a game of intense longing. The poetry celebrated the knight's absolute faithful servitude to a cruel, unattainable mistress who would never reward him.
It fused intense physical desire with religious vocabulary, elevating the woman to a quasi-divine status.
And the suffering of the unrequited lover was seen as a noble, purifying experience.
Let's fast forward 500 years to 16th century England. How does this French medieval coping mechanism translate to the court of Queen Elizabeth?
It mutates into something incredibly potent and dangerous. Because in Queen Elizabeth, the tropes of courtly love found their ultimate literal manifestation. Elizabeth was unmarried, heavily mythologized as the Virgin Queen, and she held absolute life-or-death power over her courtiers.
She is playing both roles simultaneously. She is the lady who commands chivalric, romantic devotion, but she is also the lord who commands total political obedience and controls all the wealth.
Exactly. This dual role supercharged the poetry. When courtiers like Sir Walter Raleigh or Sir Philip Sidney wrote love poetry to an unattainable mistress, they were utilizing the old courtly love tropes to navigate their real-world political relationship with the queen.
So the language of amorous devotion became the standard vocabulary of political ambition.
Yes. And the primary weapon, the vehicle they used to deliver this concentrated devotion, was the sonnet.
The sonnet. Let's break down the sonnet form for everyone listening who might be taking an exam on this.
The sonnet is a marvel of literary engineering. Originally developed in Italy, it is a lyric poem governed by strict, unyielding rules. It must be exactly 14 lines long, written in iambic pentameter with a specific rhyming structure.
Why 14 lines? Why did that specific constraint become the obsession of the entire European Renaissance?
Because of the intense psychological pressure it creates. When you only have 14 lines, you cannot digress.
Wow.
You cannot ramble. The brevity forces the poet to compress massive, overwhelming emotion, the absolute agony of unrequited love, into a tiny, highly regulated space.
It perfectly mirrors the psychological state of the courtier trying to maintain sprezzatura.
That's it, exactly. They are boiling with passion and ambition internally, but outwardly they must conform to a strict, elegant, unyielding social form.
The form is the feeling. Let's look at the different operating systems of the sonnet. The original blueprint is the Petrarchan sonnet.
Petrarch, the great Italian humanist, perfected this form, writing about his unattainable, idealized mistress, Laura. The Petrarchan sonnet is divided into two distinct parts. An octave, which is the first 8 lines rhyming ABB, which establishes a problem or an emotional conflict.
And then?
This is followed by a sestet, the final 6 lines, usually rhyming CDE, which offers a resolution, a twist, or a commentary on the problem.
Then the English get a hold of it and decide to re-engineer it. We get the Shakespearean sonnet.
Right, because the English language is famously rhyme poor compared to Italian. We just don't have as many words that naturally rhyme, so English poets adapted the form.
How so?
The Shakespearean structure breaks the poem into 3 distinct quatrains, so 3 stanzas of 4 lines each, rhyming ABAB, CD, EF, followed by a final, sharp, 2-line rhyming couplet, GG.
It allows for 3 different metaphors exploring a theme, punctuated by a quick, witty conclusion.
Precisely.
But Edmund Spenser, being the relentless innovator that he is, looks at both of these and says, I can do something vastly more complex. He creates the Spenserian sonnet.
And this is where his structural genius shines. Spenser keeps the English layout, 3 quatrains and a couplet, but he does something terrifying with the rhyme scheme. He interlocks them.
Interlocks them.
His pattern is ABAB, BCBC, CD, EE.
Explain the psychological effect of that overlapping B and C rhyme.
Well, look at the seam between the stanzas. The B rhyme that ends the first quatrain becomes the dominant rhyme that opens the second quatrain.
I see.
And the C rhyme ending the second bleeds directly into the third. Instead of 3 separate thoughts neatly packaged in their own stanzas, Spenser creates a chain-link fence.
It drags the reader forward. You can't stop at the end of the stanza because the rhyme hasn't resolved. It's pushing you into the next thought.
Exactly, it traps you. The first 12 lines feel like a single, inescapable cognitive loop. It mirrors the obsessive, inescapable nature of the lover's mind.
Wow.
You are trapped in his continuous thought process until, finally, the chain breaks at the very end with that standalone rhyming couplet, the EE, offering a sudden moment of release and objective clarity.
So we have the rules of engagement. The courtly love trope demands an unattainable, usually aristocratic or married mistress. It demands agonizing, unrequited suffering. But Spenser is a middle-class administrator.
Right, he's got different goals.
He doesn't want to pine forever after an impossible goddess. He wants to get married, establish a legitimate household, and build a dynasty on his new Irish estate. If the standard trope was the cruel, unattainable mistress, how does a guy like Spenser rewrite the rules?
That subversive act is the core of our fourth section, breaking the rules with the Amoretti sonnets.
The Amoretti, which translates to little loves, is Spenser's famous sonnet sequence, but the fundamental premise of it shatters the primary rule of the genre.
Completely. He is writing these sonnets to chronicle his actual, real-life courtship of Elizabeth Boyle, the woman who would become his second wife.
Not a married lady of the castle.
Nope. He is taking a highly stylized, inherently adulterous, often despairing poetic form and dragging it into the daylight of a real, reciprocal, Protestant courtship aimed squarely at legal marriage.
Our sources break this sequence down into three distinct emotional movements, charting the evolution of their relationship.
The sequence begins where the reader expects it to begin. The first movement, roughly sonnets 1 through 36, is anchored in the traditional mode of complaint.
He's miserable.
Very. Spenser plays the role of the miserable Petrarchan lover. He depicts Elizabeth Boyle as a tyrannical, cruel, icy goddess who relentlessly rejects his advances.
But then the tone shifts radically in the second movement.
Yes. From sonnet 37 to 69, we enter a conciliatory phase. The Petrarchan facade starts to crack. Spenser stops projecting his own misery onto her and begins to recognize her not as a static object of worship, but as a complex thinking, feeling subject.
The power dynamic begins to equalize as they negotiate a real relationship.
Exactly.
And the final movement, sonnet 70 to 87, achieves something almost unheard of in Renaissance sonnets: actual success.
The amorous enterprise succeeds. The beloved agrees to marry him. The misery is replaced by mutual, joyous agreement.
To see the specific mechanics of this subversion, let's dive deep into a few individual sonnets from the source material. I want to start in that first phase of misery, with sonnet 34, The Ship in a Storm.
Sonnet 34 is a brilliant example of how Spenser utilizes a cliché and fundamentally rewrites its internal logic. The metaphor is a standard Petrarchan trope. The lover compares himself to a ship lost at sea during a violent storm.
Classic.
Right. His beloved is his guiding star, the lodestar, but she is currently hidden behind dark clouds, leaving him to wander aimlessly in the dark, battered by the waves.
If Wyatt or Sidney were writing this, how would they handle the blame?
In the standard courtly model, the poet furiously blames the cruel mistress. Her rejection, her coldness, is the storm. She is the hostile force trying to drown him.
But Spenser refuses to do that. He completely internalizes the chaos.
It is a massive psychological pivot. Spenser does not blame Elizabeth Boyle for the storm. He explicitly identifies the violent storm as his own unquenched, turbulent internal desires.
Oh, wow.
It's his own lack of emotional regulation that is tossing the ship around.
He takes accountability. He's essentially saying, the reason I can't see your guiding light right now isn't because you were cruel. It's because I am currently blinded by my own base passion.
And he trusts that once his internal storm passes, once he masters his own desires, her pure light will guide him again. This shift perfectly utilizes that interlocking rhyme scheme we discussed.
Form meets function.
Exactly. The first 12 lines trap the reader in the disorienting, continuous turbulence of his emotional storm. The rhymes keep rolling over each other like waves.
But then you hit that final couplet.
The E couplet breaks the storm. It acts as an objective, reflective commentary. He steps outside his own anxiety and calmly states his hope that the skies will clear. The form perfectly dictates the psychological journey of the poem.
Let's move into the second phase, the conciliatory phase, with sonnet 67, The Hunt. This is where Spenser's Protestant worldview actively dismantles the aristocratic traditions of his predecessors. And to understand it, we have to look at the ghost haunting this poem, Sir Thomas Wyatt.
Yes, Spenser is writing in direct, aggressive conversation with Sir Thomas Wyatt's legendary poem, Whoso Lists to Hunt.
Okay, tell us about that one.
Both poems utilize a classical metaphor established by Petrarch, the poet as a weary huntsman chasing a beautiful, elusive deer through the woods. The deer represents the beloved.
In Wyatt's version, the hunt is an exercise in pure futility and political terror. Wyatt's huntsman is utterly exhausted and gives up the chase because he realizes he can never catch the deer. She wears a diamond collar around her neck inscribed with the words, Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am. Do not touch me, for I belong to Caesar.
Right, and in Wyatt's context, Caesar was widely understood to be King Henry VIII, and the deer was likely Anne Boleyn.
Wow.
The poem is about the terrifying realization that the woman he loves is the absolute property of a violent, omnipotent monarch. She is a status symbol earned by a more powerful man.
Spenser takes this exact setup in Sonnet 67. His huntsman also chases a deer, gets exhausted, and sits down, giving up the hunt. But the resolution is completely alien to the courtly love tradition.
After Spenser's huntsman abandons the chase, the deer, the beloved, doesn't flee. She willingly turns around and walks back to him, seeking water from the brook where he is resting. She approaches him gently, and she allows herself to be taken.
There is no diamond collar. There is no Caesar, so he essentially gives the woman agency.
That is the revolutionary breakthrough. In the traditional aristocratic model, the woman is a passive object, a prize to be captured or stolen by rival men. But Spenser, writing from a fiercely Protestant middle-class perspective, insists on mutuality.
He writes that he is victorious, but he explicitly acknowledges that his victory is only possible because of her own free will. She chooses to be caught.
Because the Protestant vision of marriage heavily emphasized companionate union, a partnership based on mutual consent and shared spiritual goals, not just dynastic property transfer.
Right, moving toward a legitimate marriage, not an adulterous affair.
Exactly. By having the deer return willingly, Spenser suggests that the beloved is a desiring subject in her own right. She is an active participant.
He is domesticating the wild eroticism of the sonnet. But that raises a massive theological problem, which leads us to Sonnet 77, the tension between the physical and the spiritual.
This is the crux of the English Renaissance anxiety. Spenser wants to celebrate his fiancée's physical beauty, but as a strict Protestant, he knows that base physical lust is a sin.
Right. How do you write an erotic poem about a woman's body without condemning your soul?
Well, he borrows a sensual image from an Italian poet, Torquato Tasso. Tasso wrote a sonnet comparing his beloved's breasts to a table laden with autumnal fruits and golden apples. Highly erotic, deeply sensual imagery.
And Spenser adopts this exact image in Sonnet 77, but he engineers a massive theological loophole.
He uses the imagery of the golden apples, but pay close attention to how he defines them in the text. He writes, exceeding sweet, yet void of sinful vice, that many sought yet none could ewer taste, sweet fruit of pleasure brought from paradise, by Lugh himself and in his garden place.
He deliberately calls them fruits from paradise, the Garden of Eden.
And that reference to paradise is doing monumental philosophical lifting here. He is referencing the state of humanity before the fall, before original sin corrupted human desires.
Oh, I see.
In Eden, the physical and the spiritual were not in conflict, they were perfectly unified. Physical pleasure was a holy expression of divine creation.
So he's arguing that her physical beauty is so pure, so uncorrupted, that it doesn't inspire dirty, base lust. It inspires a holy spiritual appreciation.
I would urge anyone studying this era to lock onto this specific concept. Spenser's ultimate trick is reconciling the Neoplatonic ideal with the Protestant doctrine.
Break that down for us.
Neoplatonism, imported from Italy, argued that physical beauty was merely a stepping stone, a lower manifestation that should eventually lead the mind to contemplate invisible, purely spiritual beauty.
But the Protestant ideal specifically celebrated conjugal physical sexuality within marriage as a holy, sanctified act superior to Catholic celibacy.
Yes, so by saying her physical body is a table laden with the fruits of paradise, Spenser is fusing the two. He declares that he can righteously enjoy the sensual, erotic experience of her physical beauty because it is a direct, uncorrupted pathway to her internal spiritual purity.
He is feasting at the table of her virtues.
He takes the dangerous eroticism of the Italians and successfully baptizes it in Protestant theology.
It is a stunning intellectual balancing act. And because the Amorati sequence ends in success, this theological framework leads directly to the altar. Spenser wrote what is basically the greatest wedding anthem of the 16th century to celebrate his own marriage.
Which brings us to the monumental fifth section of our deep dive, the epithalamion and its dark twin, the prothalamion.
Let's start with the triumph, the epithalamion. The word itself comes from Greek, meaning at the bridal chamber. Historically, it was a celebratory body song sung by the community outside the bedroom on a couple's wedding night. But Spenser turns it into a cosmic monument.
The sheer mathematical and architectural genius of this poem is staggering.
The math of the poem just blows my mind.
On the surface, it is a joyous, exuberant chronicle of Spenser's own wedding day, moving from dawn to the wedding night. But underneath the lush imagery, Spenser built a literal calendar out of words.
The structural constraints he placed on himself are insane. The poem consists of exactly 24 stanzas.
Representing the 24 hours of the wedding day.
And within those 24 stanzas, he wove exactly 365 long lines. Lines written in a longer meter than the surrounding text.
Representing the 365 days of the solar year.
Why go through that agonizing structural effort? What is the philosophical point of the math?
He is attempting to solve the problem of time and decay. A wedding day is a joyous but ultimately fleeting temporal event.
Right, it ends.
But by embedding the 24 hours, the micro, inside the 365 days, the macro, Spenser mathematically merges the temporary fleeting celebration of a single day with the eternal enduring monument of a lifelong marriage. He freezes time through formal structure.
You can literally hear the passage of time in the poem through his use of the refrain. Almost every single stanza ends with a joyous, echoing chorus. The wood shall to me answer and my echo ring. The entire natural world is shouting in celebration.
But the math dictates the reality of the day. Because they were married in Ireland in the summer, specifically on the summer solstice, they had roughly 16 hours of daylight and 8 hours of darkness.
And at exactly stanza 17, the 17th hour of the poem, the refrain abruptly pivots.
The sun goes down. The refrain shifts to the negative. The woods no more shall answer, nor your echo ring.
Wow.
The loud public celebration of the daylight ceases. The community retreats, the noise dies down, and the poem enters the private, intimate silence of the bridal chamber.
But even inside that private chamber, even on his own wedding night, Spenser is still wrestling with that intense Protestant anxiety about the female body. How does he describe his bride as she prepares for the wedding?
He utilizes a specific literary technique known as the architectural blazon.
A blazon.
A blazon is a standard poetic catalog where the poet dissects the woman's body, listing her beautiful parts. Eyes like sapphires, lips like rubies, skin like ivory. In stanzas 10 and 11, Spenser indulges in this deeply sensual, objectifying catalog.
But he immediately realizes he's wandering into dangerous, lustful territory.
So he constructs a theological defense mechanism. In the very next breath, having just celebrated her physical parts, he pivots and compares her entire body to a massive, imposing palace.
The text says, and all her body like a palace fair, ascending vitae with many a stately stair, to honor's seat and chastity's sweet bower.
He transforms the sensual woman into a fortress of virtue. He insists that inside this beautiful physical palace dwells constant chastity, unspotted faith, and mild modesty.
He goes so far as to personify her internal virtue as a queen in royal throne who geeth laws alone, and whom the base affections must absolutely obey.
He is literally putting a monarch inside her mind to police her own bodily desires. Her spiritual purity rules over her physical urges with an iron fist.
It solves his theological problem. It allows Spenser to exuberantly, almost voyeuristically celebrate her physical beauty because he has rhetorically contained that dangerous sexuality within a strict, feudal, Protestant framework of control.
The physical desires are locked in the dungeon, ruled by the Queen of Chastity.
It's a brilliant intellectual defense, but frankly, it feels a bit chilling. He spends so much effort turning her into an allegorical fortress that the actual living, breathing woman gets erased. She becomes a heavily policed monument to his own moral ideology.
The text undeniably reveals a deeply possessive, objectified view of the bride. This is further highlighted by Spenser's pervasive use of commercial vocabulary throughout the poem.
Right.
He invokes merchants' daughters. He talks about the usury of long delight. Even in the midst of his spiritual and romantic triumph, Spenser's mind is heavily preoccupied with commerce, acquisition, and ownership.
Which perfectly sets up the tragic, bitter sequel, the prothalamion.
Spenser actually coined the word prothalamion. The epithalamion is the song at the bridal chamber. The prothalamion is the song sung prior to the chamber, a preliminary celebration.
But unlike the deeply personal epithalamion, this was a mercenary job.
He was a hired gun. In 1596, Spenser was commissioned to write a poem celebrating the high society double wedding of Elizabeth and Catherine Somerset, the daughters of the powerful Earl of Worcester.
And on the surface, the imagery is beautiful, if a bit sedate. He uses this elaborate mythological allegory, comparing the two aristocratic brides to two beautiful swans sailing down the River Thames. He references the classical myth of Jove and Leda and utilizes that famous hypnotic refrain. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song.
It sounds like a lovely conventional piece of aristocratic flattery. But when you analyze the structural placement of the stanzas and the thematic deviations, a completely different, shocking motive emerges.
The poem is a Trojan horse.
Exactly. The Potholamian is not primarily a celebration of the Somerset sisters. It is a deeply bitter, politically calculated complaint about Spenser's own failing career.
Let's look at the sheer audacity of this. He is commissioned to write a joyous wedding poem for two young women, and how does he open the very first stanza of the poem?
He opens by ignoring the brides entirely. He writes that he walked out to the River Thames on a hot day to ease his own intense psychological pain. He says his brain is afflicted by sullen care entirely because of his long, fruitless stay in Prince's court and his expectation vain of idle hopes, which still do fly away.
Wait, he hijacked someone else's wedding poem to complain about his own career and lack of networking success.
Oh, he absolutely did.
He is standing at this elite gathering essentially saying, yes, the brides look nice, but let's talk about the fact that Queen Elizabeth hasn't increased my pension and my career is stalling.
And he pushes the political agenda even further. In stanza 8, as the allegorical bridal procession of swans floats past a specific stately home on the Thames, Spenser stops the narrative entirely to mourn his former deceased patron, the powerful Earl of Leicester, who used to occupy that house.
He writes about how much he desperately misses the gifts and goodly grace of that great lord, and loudly complains to the audience about his current friendless case.
He is using this high-profile aristocratic wedding as a billboard to signal to the elite men in attendance, specifically the Earl of Essex, who was present. He's saying, I am a brilliant poet. I am currently without a powerful patron. I am miserable. Sponsor me.
It shatters the illusion of the serene, unbothered artist. It exposes the brutal, humiliating dependency of the patronage system. A poet could write the most mathematically perfect, spiritually transcendent epic in the English language, but if he didn't have a wealthy lord paying his rent, he would starve.
The Proclaimian is dripping with the anger and exhaustion of a man who realizes that his towering genius still isn't enough to secure his safety.
It is the ultimate testament to the duality of Edmund Spenser. He was a man capable of touching the absolute heights of Platonic idealism and religious ecstasy, while simultaneously remaining fiercely, desperately tethered to the brutal economic realities of the 16th century corporate ladder.
It really is.
We have charted a massive course today. Let's synthesize the core architecture of everything we've unpacked for anyone prepping for an exam or just trying to wrap their head around this.
The foundational takeaway is the immense friction of the English Renaissance. Spenser's entire body of work is a monumental attempt to synthesize the beautiful, sensual humanism imported from Italy with the strict, austere moralism of the English Protestant Reformation.
We saw how he weaponized the sonnet form. He took the Spenserian interlocking rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D, E, E, and used it to create a cognitive trap, pulling the reader through the psychological turbulence of courtship before breaking the tension with that final couplet.
And we observed his radical subversion of courtly love in the Amoretti. He rejected the medieval obsession with unattainable adulterous suffering.
Right.
By giving the beloved agency, like the deer returning willingly, he pioneered a Protestant poetics that celebrated mutual consenting love culminating in legitimate marriage.
And finally, we witnessed the terrifying structural genius of the epithalamion, fusing the 24 hours and 365 days into a monument that contained the chaotic physical desires of the body within the strict architectural palace of Protestant virtue.
It is an unparalleled literary achievement. But delving into the gritty reality of his biography leaves us with a profound, lingering question about the nature of art and ambition.
We started this deep dive talking about marble statues, the historical fantasy that great art requires a pure, unbothered vessel. The sources force us to admit that Edmund Spenser was a relentless hustler.
He scrubbed floors to get his education.
He participated in a brutal colonial occupation to secure a 3,000-acre estate.
He hijacked wedding poems to beg for money.
He wrote transcendent masterpieces, but he wrote them to secure a pension and force the aristocracy to accept him.
So the crucial question for you listening at home is, does knowing the sheer desperate careerism of the man diminish the spiritual majesty of his poetry?
Or
Or does recognizing how relentlessly he had to fight, understanding the profound economic anxiety and political terror that fueled every single stanza, made his achievement of blending the sacred and the profane infinitely more impressive?
that's the real question. It's easy to write about eternal, unbothered love when you have a trust fund and an army protecting your castle. It is a completely different kind of genius to build a flawless mathematical palace of virtues while you are terrified about your political survival and watching your literal castle burn to the ground.
That is the true legacy of the English Renaissance.
Yeah.
The poetry wasn't an escape from the brutal reality of the world. It was the weapon they used to conquer it.
Keep questioning the text, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.